What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into our starts and sits for the wide receiver position for week 4 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in and hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like button and subscribe, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Starts, sits, trades, waiver wire, quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, kickers, defense, whatever it may be, let me know down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday Night Football, we got a pretty good matchup for the week. We've got the Dolphins at the Bengals, and I'm starting just about everyone in this game. I'm a fan of both of these offenses. Tyreek Hill is still a start for me. Comes in as wide receiver number 5 in full PPR, and that is with just having 5.3 fantasy points in week 3. A little bit of a bummer overall after having 17 points in week 1 and 42 points in week 2. But obviously, if you own Tyreek Hill, you have to start him. The upside is far too valuable. Jalen Waddle, on the other hand, has been a little bit more consistent on these seasons, sitting at wide receiver 4 in full PPR. He's an absolute must start as well. 17.7 points in week 1, 40.1 in week 2, 15.1 in week 3 versus Buffalo. This is Tua's security blanket, and he is a threat in the red zone as well. Waddle and Hill need to be in your starting lineups going into Thursday night, going into week 4 as a whole. The Bengals receivers, on the other hand, I don't want to say they've been disappointing, but at least Jamar Chase has been a little bit disappointing to fantasy managers looking at the draft capital that they spent on him. But overall, he's still your wide receiver 14 in full PPR. 28.9 points in week 1, 10.8 in week 2, 11.7 in week 3 versus the Jets. He has 2 touchdowns on the season, 212 receiving yards, and 21 receptions off 35 targets. Similar to a guy like Tyreek Hill, if you drafted Chase, he's in your starting lineups regardless of the matchup overall. So I still like Chase moving in to week 4. T. Higgins is having himself a pretty solid season as well, coming in a little bit lower in the rankings at wide receiver 34 with that 4.7 point performance in week 1, but 19.1 points in week 2 and 14.3 in week 3, and that's with a questionable touchdown call that definitely was probably a touchdown in my humble opinion. But overall, we saw 7 targets, 5 receptions, 93 receiving yards on the day for Higgins, so he remains a start. He is dealing with a toe injury, so keep an eye on Higgins' health going into the Thursday night matchup. A short week overall. He is questionable at the moment, but he has tended to play through a lot of injuries. Tyler Boyd is a flex for me, coming in at wide receiver 31, so actually slightly higher than T. Higgins. And like I said, keep a close eye on T. Higgins' health. If Higgins is out, then Boyd is an automatic start and a really solid flex in my opinion. 13.3 points in week 1 for Boyd, 5.7 in week 2, but 20.5 in week 3 versus the Jets. 5 targets, 4 receptions, 105 receiving yards, and a score. Boyd is really going to be a flex option because he is the true wide receiver 3 on this team, but he's a beautiful handcuff. If anything happens to Higgins or Chase, God forbid it, but Boyd automatically rises in fantasy value, so I like him as a flex going into week 4. All right, we got the Vikings at Saints, an early game, a London game on Sunday. So obviously, if you own Justin Jefferson, you just have to start him. Listen, I know he's been a little bit disappointing after the monster week 1 performance, but he's still coming in as wide receiver 9 in full PPR. I don't see any reason to panic on JJ. 39.4 fantasy points in week 1, 10.8 in week 2, 4.4 in week 3. Listen, if you own Justin Jefferson, you have to start him. It's a little bit of a tough matchup going up against Marshawn Lattimore. Saints defense has looked pretty good throughout the season, but they're still not looking incredible by any means. So it's short and simple. If you own JJ, he's got to be in your starting lineups. The upside is just far too valuable to put him on your bench for any reason. Adam Thielen had himself a nice day in week 3 versus Detroit. 18.1 fantasy points, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 61 receiving yards, and a score. I mean, this has always been historically Kirk Cousins' best friend in the red zone, and he did find the end zone in week 3. So I like him as a flex overall. Not much more than that. He's got 19 targets, 13 receptions, 149 receiving yards, and a score on the season, coming in as wide receiver 40 in both standard and PPR. So I don't hate Thielen. I don't love him. I think he's no more than a flex. But if we continue to see the pattern emerge of Thielen being targeted enough in the end zone and catching those touchdowns, then he's definitely going to be a solid flex on a weekly basis. I'm just a little bit hesitant until we see that true pattern emerge. KJ Osborne also had a nice day in week 3, 18.3 fantasy points, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 73 receiving yards, and a score, including the game-winning score against the Lions. So I like KJ Osborne as a flex, kind of, but I just don't know, right? 4.4 fantasy points in week 1, 4.5 in week 2. I think he's a player to watch. He's worth picking up off the waivers, especially in deeper leagues and full PPR leagues. But for now, he's just a watch. We saw this happen last year, right? KJ Osborne would have 2 or 3 bum games and then a really productive game or 2 and then go back to non-productivity. So we just want to keep an eye on KJ Osborne. Similar to Adam Thielen, if we see patterns emerge with these 2 receivers, they might become flexes on the season. But for now, they're no more than flexes. And KJ Osborne, in my opinion, is just a player we're keeping a close eye on. All right, moving on to the Saints. Michael Thomas kind of came back to earth in week 3. Still comes in as wide receiver 16 in full PPR. 22.7 points in week 1, 18.5 in week 2, 9.9 in week 2, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 49 receiving yards. He did suffer a toe injury, but is likely not serious. So we want to keep an eye on Michael Thomas's health, but what he has shown throughout the season, even with a poor performance in week 3, is that we absolutely need to have him in our starting lineup. Looking at the draft capital you spent on him, he's either a wide receiver 2 or a flex option on your roster. So I think he's a great start moving into week 4 as long as he's healthy, right? Chris Olave, on the other hand, starting to make some waves after a poor week 1 in which he still had 9.1 fantasy points. Week 2, he had 10 fantasy points. We saw a large uptick in targets at 13 targets in week 2, although just 5 receptions for 80 receiving yards. And week 3, it's starting to come a little bit together overall for Olave, a rookie we really liked here at the channel in the pre-season. He did have 13 targets once again, but most importantly, he caught 9 of them for 147 receiving yards. He has led the Saints in receiving for 2 weeks straight. He netted 23.7 fantasy points in week 3. So I think Olave is a solid flex going up against Minnesota in week 4, and definitely a pattern that we want to keep an eye on. Olave might become a true starter for fantasy squads out there. Jarvis Landry, we've seen a negative pattern emerge after the big 18.4 performance in week 1, 6.5 points in week 2, 4.2 in week 3. He's dealing with some sort of foot injury. He's questionable at the moment. So I think Jarvis Landry is a sit. All right, Seahawks at Lions. I've got Metcalf as a start. I'm liking the Lions as a team that we can start offensive players against. They have kind of shown that they are going to bend, maybe not necessarily break, but still give up productive days to opposing fantasy offenses. So Metcalf had a great game in week 3 after 7.6 points in week 1, 7.5 in week 2. He had his best stat line of the year in week 3 versus Atlanta, 17.4 fantasy points, 12 targets, 5 receptions, 64 receiving yards, and most importantly, he found the end zone, 1 touchdown. So I like Metcalf once again in this matchup if you don't have better options. Tyler Lockett starting to emerge. Lockett has actually been the better fantasy receiver for the Seahawks on the season. 5.8 fantasy points in week 1, 19.7 in week 2, 16.6 in week 3, 11 targets in both week 2 and week 3. Overall in week 3, he had 9 receptions, 76 receiving yards. So in full PPR, Lockett is starting to emerge as a solid flex overall. Like I said, I like Metcalf and Lockett in this matchup. You could consider Metcalf a flex as well, just because the upside is still kind of capped with Geno Smith at the quarterback position, which is not too much of a knock. Realistically, Geno Smith is playing decent football, but from a fantasy perspective, he's not necessarily delivering on the marks. But like I said, I like Metcalf and Lockett just all right moving into week 4. All right, moving on to the Lions receiving core. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I've said it, week in and week out throughout the season thus far. He is a start on a weekly basis as long as he is listed as healthy. He is far too good of a receiver. He's still sitting at wide receiver 3 in full PPR after having just 13.3 fantasy points in week 3 compared to 20.4 in week 1 and 39.4 in week 2. 9 targets, 6 receptions, 73 receiving yards for St. Brown in week 3. He has been diagnosed with a minor ankle injury, so I'm sure he's going to do everything he can to suit up Sunday, but we may be looking at a Sunday for the Lions without DeAndre Swift and without Amon-Ra St. Brown. Definitely something to pay attention to because it's going to affect the fantasy outcomes of the rest of the offense. Speaking of the rest of the offense, DJ Chark had an okay day in week 3, 7.6 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 receptions, 46 receiving yards. That's after a 15.2 fantasy day in week 1 and a true goose egg, 0 points in week 2. So I haven't seen enough of a consistent pattern emerge for DJ Chark where I feel confident in recommending to start him. But if Amon-Ra St. Brown doesn't play, you could look at DJ Chark as a streaming handcuff wide receiver option if you really don't have better options. It's a good matchup versus Seattle, so I'll say that much. I do think Josh Reynolds is someone you can consider flexing in full PPR leagues, especially in deeper leagues. 12.8 fantasy points in week 2, 15.6 in week 3 after having a stinker of 3.8 in week 1. The important thing to remember with Josh Reynolds is he has that chemistry with Jared Goff from the days where they were both on the Rams. So I've always been a fan of the connection between Goff and Reynolds on the Lions. Overall in week 3, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 96 receiving yards. So if you're in deeper leagues, especially if Amon-Ra St. Brown sits, I think Josh Reynolds is worth a flex if you don't have better options moving into week 4. All right, Jets at Steelers. There's a couple things to pay attention to with this matchup. The main thing is Zach Wilson may be returning at the quarterback position. So I don't quite know how that's going to affect the Jets wide receiving core. But let's start with Garrett Wilson, who's sitting at wide receiver 15 in full PPR, 9.2 points in week 1, 30 points in week 2. Still had a solid day in week 3 with 12 points in full PPR formats, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 60 receiving yards. So it's obvious that the Jets head coaching staff wants to feed Garrett Wilson, and I think he is definitely a talented receiver who's a perfect wide receiver 2 and or flex, maybe a little bit better at the flex position, but I still like Wilson even if Zach Wilson comes back at the quarterback position. It's going to be interesting to see how these receivers are affected going from Joe Flacco, who's been tossing the football around quite a bit, to Zach Wilson if he is truly ready to play in week 4. Elijah Moore has been a little bit of a disappointment. I mean, really an absolute disappointment so far on the season. 9.9 points in week 1, 6.5 in week 2, 8.9 in week 3. But Elijah Moore and Zach Wilson have shown great chemistry with one another. So I think you can roll the dice in week 4 if Wilson is truly ready and put Elijah Moore in your flex position if you don't have better options. But just understand, I've got an asterisk there because they're kind of rolling the dice. We really want to see that pattern emerge before we make this move. But like I said, I think you can consider it moving in to week 4. Corey Davis is a sit for me. He was playing pretty good football overall when the Jets passing offense was looking better in the first 2 weeks of the season. They just didn't look quite as good overall in week 3 versus Cincinnati. So 13.7 points in week 1 for Davis, 16.3 in week 2, 4.7 in week 3. So I think you leave him as a sit. You probably have better options to where you don't have to start Corey Davis. Maybe in deeper leagues you could consider it, but I think he's best off as a sit moving into week 4. Looking at the Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers, Deontay Johnson remains a start for me. Is the upside and ceiling capped? Yes, the upside and ceiling is capped for every player within this offense. This offense just does not look incredibly productive, but we still have to look at guys like Najee Harris and Deontay Johnson as week in and week out starters for our fantasy rosters, especially in full PPR formats in regards to Deontay Johnson. He's coming in as wide receiver 29 at the moment, 11.5 fantasy points in week 1, 13.7 in week 2, 16.4 in week 3. He has at least 10 targets in every game this season, so he's gotten you double-digit fantasy points every week of the season in full PPR. He's still a start for me, but when we look at guys like Chase Claypool, who has had exactly 6 targets every game of the season, he has just not been productive enough to be a start. And I put George Pickens as a sit because obviously he has the incredible one-handed catch versus Cleveland on Thursday Night Football. George Pickens, maybe his stock is starting to rise again like we saw in the offseason, but we haven't seen a consistent enough pattern emerge to where Pickens needs to be in starting lineups. He's fine on the bench if you want to stash him, but even with a better game overall in week 3, 7 targets, 3 receptions, 39 receiving yards, he still only netted 6.9 fantasy points in full PPR. So Pickens is still a sit for me. I think the only receiver worth starting for the Pittsburgh Steelers is Deontay Johnson moving into week 4. All right, Bears at Giants. Man, oh man, Darnell Mooney, one of my favorite late round, mid round draft selections, especially in full PPR formats. Luckily didn't land to me in any of my leagues because, man, he is playing really bad football. And I mean, I don't know if it's all Mooney's fault. The Bears overall are just not a productive offense from a fantasy perspective outside of the running back position. So any Bears receivers are a sit for me, but Darnell Mooney, I mean, it's just been so disappointing. Just 11 targets on the season, 4 receptions, 27 receiving yards. This brings him in as wide receiver number 113 overall. There's no other receivers worth starting. I mean, St. Brown is having actually a better season than Darnell Mooney, but he's still not worth starting. 8.8 points in week 1, 5.9 in week 2, 7.3 in week 3. Dante Pettis has barely done anything. He has 1 target, 1 reception on the season. There's just nothing here from a fantasy perspective to even consider. Any Bears receivers are a sit for me. And speaking of a team that has all sits for me, the Giants receivers are also all sits for me. Really, the only receiver you could consider as a starter on a weekly basis, in my opinion, was Sterling Shepard, who is now out for the season with a torn ACL. You hate to see this. It's absolutely awful. After drawing 10 targets in his last 2 games and putting up at least respectable fantasy stat lines throughout the season, 15.1 in week 1, 9.4 in week 2, 9.9 in week 3. Not amazing, but when you look at this offense and their passing attack, pretty decent overall. Shepard is out of the picture. Kenny Golladay has 5 targets, 2 receptions on the season. He is not playing good football. Richie James, you could take a look at if you absolutely need to in deeper leagues. 11.1 points in week 1, 10.1 in week 2, and 8 fantasy points on the dot in week 3. He's probably your best option. Robinson has 1 target, 1 reception. Kadarius Toney has 3 targets, 2 receptions. This offense is just not producing viable fantasy starters whatsoever. Like I said, the only player you could drastically consider is Richie James. I'm not in love with that he's still coming in as wide receiver 47. It's going to be interesting to see how things shake out with Shepard's injury. Maybe we see someone emerge as a number 1 option, but until we see it, let's just sit the Giants receivers. Outside of super deep leagues, there's no reason to be considering any Bears receivers or Giants receivers moving into week 4. All right, Titans at Colts. Always an interesting matchup when these two teams go at it. I think Robert Woods is an okay flex. I didn't like him last week going up against Vegas after he had 2.3 points in week 1, 7.9 in week 2, 12.5 points in week 3, a pretty decent stat line, 9 targets, 4 receptions, 85 receiving yards. So I have him as a flex, but that's really just if you don't have better options, and I would be very wary of starting Robert Woods in leagues that are not full PPR formats. That's really the only place where he has shown any value. 0 touchdowns on the season. Treylon Burks is a player to continue to watch. We're starting to see a promising pattern emerge 8.5 fantasy points in week 1, 8.7 in week 2, and then a bummer of a week in week 3 at 3.1 fantasy points. But all it's going to take is one explosive game for a lot of fantasy managers to start considering Treylon Burks. So if you own him, keep an eye on him. If you don't own him, continue to watch him, but I don't think he's start worthy in week 4. And like I said, Robert Woods is really only a flex if you don't have better options. All right, Michael Pittman coming in as wide receiver 24 and full PPR, 27.1 points in week 1. Did not play in week 2, so we know he had 0 points there, but then bounced back nicely against Kansas City, 15.2 fantasy points in full PPR, 9 targets, 8 receptions, 72 receiving yards. I like the matchup versus Tennessee. If you own Pittman, he should be in your starting lineups moving into week 4. All right, Chargers at Texans. Keenan Allen is expected to return to practice this week after missing the last 2 weeks with a hamstring injury. So if Keenan Allen is listed as healthy, he is a starter for you on a weekly basis. It's a great matchup versus the Houston Texans, so there's really no doubt about it, right? I have an asterisk there in case he doesn't suit up, but if he does suit up, he's absolutely in your starting lineups, especially in full PPR leagues. I expect a bounce back game from the Chargers here in week 4. Mike Williams continues to be a boomer bust player on a weekly basis, but you just can't sit him. The upside is far too high. Herbert wasn't necessarily 100% in Sunday's matchup versus Jacksonville, so we want to kind of give the Chargers offense some leeway. I think they have a better game versus the Texans. 3 points in week 1 for Williams, 25.3 in week 2, 8.5 in week 3. He kind of savored his fantasy stat line by finding the end zone, but that touchdown grab was a 15-yard grab, was his only reception off 6 targets on the day. So there definitely could have been a better fantasy stat line here. So still a little bit of a disappointment, although he found the end zone. And I would expect, I mean, we just see this pattern from Mike Williams, right? 3 points in week 1, over 25 points in week 2, just 8.5 in week 3. He's due for a good game in week 4. I think he should be in your starting lineups if you own him. His upside is just way too high to have him on the bench unless you have really, really good depth. Maybe there are other players you can consider. I would keep an eye on Josh Palmer. If Keenan Allen doesn't play, well, then Josh Palmer becomes a viable fantasy starter. One of the main reasons we talked about Palmer over the last week or so in terms of a waiver wire addition is for the fact that he can still carve out a really nice role in this offense as the wide receiver 3, even when Allen does come back. So 13 fantasy points in week 2 with Allen out, 15.9 in week 3 with Allen out. He has at least 8 targets in his last 2 games. He's definitely a player to keep an eye on and a player you can consider as a flex if Allen is not good to go. All right, Brandon Cooks of the Houston Texans has been pretty disappointing on the season. Wide receiver 50 in full PPR at the moment. I actually really liked him going up against Chicago in week 3. I actually recommended him as a start for a lot of you guys, and he had a bum day. 4.2 fantasy points, 7 targets, 2 receptions, 22 receiving yards. Not a good day after having 9.4 points in week 2, 15.2 in week 1. I really thought week 3 was potential for Brandon Cooks to kind of have one of those breakout games we're used to seeing him have a couple times a year. And now I've got him as a sit moving into week 4. I just don't like this Texans offense. Nico Collins has really been a disappointment for those of you who went out and targeted him late in your drafts. Overall, he did outperform Brandon Cooks, but he's still coming in as wide receiver 71, 4.6 points in week 1, 9.8 in week 2, 6.1 in week 3, just 4 targets, 2 receptions, 41 receiving yards in week 3. I mean, you look at the week before, he had 58 receiving yards. Like, if he could find the end zone, there's some value here. But until we see that pattern emerge, both Brandon Cooks and Nico Collins are going to be sits for me moving into week 4. All right, Browns at Falcons. Talk about a player that I got wrong in the offseason. Was not a fan of Amari Cooper in the offseason and the potential connection between Cooper and Jacoby Brissett. But guess what? The Brissett has proven me wrong like usual, and Cooper is playing out of his mind in terms of a wide receiver 1 on a semi-lackluster offense for the Browns, a run-first offense for the Browns. Cooper is playing really good football, coming in as wide receiver 12 in full PPR. Not a great week 1 at 4.7 fantasy points, but week 2, 25.1 fantasy points. Week 3, 23.1 fantasy points, 11 targets, 7 receptions, 101 receiving yards, and a score. He now has exactly 101 receiving yards in his last 2 games and 1 touchdown in his last 2 games, and at least 10 targets, at least 7 receptions. He is absolutely a must start at this point until we see a negative pattern emerge. Cooper is in your starting lineups. DPJ continues to be a sit for me. Had a nice week 1, but then 0 points in week 2 and just 2 points in week 3. And really, outside of Amari Cooper, there's no reason to be starting any Browns wide receivers overall. But like I said, Cooper is officially a must start and in your lineups on a week-to-week basis. All right, Drake London is coming in as wide receiver 13 in full PPR, just 1 spot behind Amari Cooper. 12.4 points in week 1, 24.6 in week 2, 14.4 in week 3. He now has a touchdown in his last 2 games and at least 6 targets. So I like Drake London at the moment. He's playing good football. He's been impressive as a rookie. I think it's a relatively good matchup versus Cleveland. So I like London. I do think he is a really good flex option and a perfectly fine wide receiver 2 option moving into week 4. All right, Commanders at Cowboys. The Washington Commanders kind of came back to earth in week 3 against a very good Eagles team at home. Scary Terry still got it done though. 16.2 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 102 receiving yards. Overall, Terry McLaurin has proven he should be in your starting lineups, especially in full PPR formats. I mean, he's gotten you double-digit fantasy points every game this year so far. So I'm still a fan of McLaurin. I do think he is start-worthy 100%. Curtis Samuel, on the other hand, is actually coming in a little bit higher overall at the wide receiver position, coming in as wide receiver 10 at the moment. 18.2 fantasy points in week 1, 22.9 in week 2, 13.1 in week 3 versus Philadelphia. 10 targets, 7 receptions, 48 receiving yards in that game. So he led the team in targets in week 3's loss. I think that Samuel is a really good flex option. I do think that the Washington Commanders are probably going to not have as great of a game, in comparison to what we saw in weeks 1 and week 2. I do think that Dallas has a pretty good defense, but I always like these NFC East matchups. I'm a fan of NFC East matchups. Just things kind of go out the window when these teams play each other. So I think Curtis Samuel is a perfectly fine start. Jahan Dotson, on the other hand, had a bummer of a week in week 3 with just 3 fantasy points after having 18 fantasy points in week 1 and 17.9 in week 2. He's coming in as wide receiver 32 overall. I think he's a fine flex option, but out of Samuel and Dotson, I still lean Curtis Samuel. I want to see a little bit of a more consistent pattern emerge for Jahan Dotson, which I absolutely think can happen. He does hold a lot of nice upside. So I'm still a fan of Dotson overall, but I would leave him as a flex. All right, moving on to the Cowboys offense. CeeDee Lamb is still a start for me. He has actually performed better with Cooper Rush at the quarterback position in comparison to Dak Prescott in week 1. So 15.1 fantasy points in week 2, 22.7 in week 3 versus the New York Giants on Monday Night Football. 12 targets, 8 receptions, 87 receiving yards, and a score, and a really nice one-handed grab at that. So CeeDee Lamb, especially in full PPR, continues to be a start on a weekly basis. All right, we want to watch both Noah Brown and Michael Gallup for the Cowboys to see who emerges as the wide receiver 2, right? Noah Brown has filled in really nicely while Michael Gallup has missed time. There is potential that Michael Gallup could suit up in week 4, so we have to kind of pay attention, right? Gallup is probably worth rolling the dice on in the flex position if he does start, but we don't want to discredit Noah Brown. He comes in as wide receiver 25 in full PPR, 11.8 fantasy points in week 1, 20.1 in week 2, 10.4 in week 3. He's had at least 5 targets and at least 5 receptions in every game this year. He has 1 score on the year, and he dropped a touchdown in week 3. So I still like Noah Brown. He's done enough to solidify a role within this offense. But if Gallup does suit up and play, we have to kind of see how the pattern looks between those 2 receivers and who really solidifies himself as the wide receiver 2. I think there's an argument for Noah Brown to continue to be the guy, but you just never know. Gallup is a very talented receiver. So you can roll the dice and flex Noah Brown or Michael Gallup in this matchup. The Washington Commanders are definitely not a team with a solid secondary, but you just have to understand if Gallup does suit up, you're kind of rolling the dice overall moving into week 4. Jaguars at Eagles. I'm starting Christian Kirk. I know it's a tough matchup. I know Darius Slay is out there. I get it, guys. Christian Kirk is playing really good football. I love Christian Kirk right now. Wide receiver 6 in full PPR, one of the best values in your entire draft. 17.7 points in week 1, 25.8 in week 2, 19.2 in week 3 versus the Chargers. He has at least 6 targets in every game this year, at least 6 receptions, at least 72 receiving yards, and he has 3 touchdowns on the season. We don't need to say more. Christian Kirk, who's probably your wide receiver 2 or your flex, should absolutely be a start on a week in, week out basis, regardless of the matchup, until we see a negative pattern emerge. Zay Jones is playing pretty good football. 12.5 fantasy points in week 1, 5.3 in week 2, 24.5 in week 3. I think we continue to watch Zay Jones, right? He's very close to a flex for me, but with the week 2 performance being weak, I think we want to kind of just keep an eye on what Zay Jones does. In deeper leagues, full PPR, yeah, you can pull the trigger and start Zay Jones, but I think overall for most fantasy managers, if you did pick him up on the waivers, either last week or this week, whatever it may be, just continue to monitor this offense and this usage. But this offense is humming, man. They are moving in the right direction. Marvin Jones had a nice week in week 3, found the end zone, 33 receiving yards off 7 targets, 4 receptions, netted you 13.3 fantasy points, but 7.8 points in week 1, 6.3. I just want to see a little bit more consistency out of Marvin Jones. I do think he's another receiver to keep a close eye on. I kind of lean towards Zay Jones. Had a better pattern kind of emerged through 3 games, but Zay Jones and Marvin Jones, we absolutely want to keep an eye on, because like I said, the Jags offense is absolutely moving in the right direction. Talk about an offense that's been moving in the right direction all season long. The Philadelphia Eagles look like one of the best teams in the league. If this team can stay healthy, they're going to be a threat throughout the entire season. This offense is beautiful from a fantasy perspective. Our guy Jalen Hurts, who we loved in the offseason, is getting it done. This offense is humming, man. All right, AJ Brown is your wide receiver 7 in full PPR. He's a must start. 25.5 points in week 1, 11.9 in week 2, 19.5 in week 3. Scored his first touchdown on the season versus Washington. AJ Brown's in your lineup, not a lot to say. Talk about my boy Devonta Smith, one of my favorite mid to late round draft selections in the offseason. After giving us a true goose egg in week 1, 15 fantasy points in week 2, and a monster performance in week 3 versus Washington, 30.9 fantasy points, 12 targets, 8 receptions, 169 receiving yards, and a score that netted you over 30 fantasy points in week 3. Devonta Smith, who's probably a wide receiver 2 or flex option for you, should be in your starting lineups against a very vulnerable Jaguars defense. I love this matchup. 4 guys like Christian Kirk, AJ Brown, and Devonta Smith, and I still think probably Zay Jones or Marvin Jones has a good game as well. I love this matchup moving into week 4. All right, Bills at Ravens. This is a matchup I really like as well. This is a matchup where I can see a lot of points scored and a lot of good fantasy stat lines. Stephon Diggs is your wide receiver 1 in full PPR after having his worst performance of the year in week 3 versus Miami. 14.4 fantasy points, 11 targets, 7 receptions, 74 receiving yards. He's still your wide receiver 1, 26.2 fantasy points in week 1, 44.8 in week 2. Stephon Diggs is in your starting lineup. Come on, there's no question about it. Gabe Davis has kind of come back to earth after the nice performance in week 1, 18.8 fantasy points, and he missed week 2 and 6.7 fantasy points in week 3. 37 receiving yards off 3 receptions and 6 targets, but Gabe Davis is still a start for me. I think he's a perfectly fine wide receiver 2 or flex option for you. Obviously, he's part of this Bills offense that we want pieces of in our starting lineup, even if they semi-struggled versus Miami in week 3. Like I said, this Ravens defense has really shown that they will give up some points, so I like Gabe Davis here in week 4. Isaiah McKenzie is a player to continue to monitor. He's a little bit touchdown dependent, but he did have 76 receiving yards in week 3, 9 targets, 7 receptions for 21.2 fantasy points, 9.9 points in week 1 where he did find the end zone, and 5.7 points in week 2, 3 targets in week 1, and 3 targets in week 2. So when he was targeted more here in week 3, he had a really nice fantasy stat line. I think he's absolutely worth grabbing off the waivers if he's still floating around. He's a player to keep a strong eye on, but until we see a consistent pattern emerge, we want to continue to watch him. I think in deeper leagues, if you need to use him as a flex, it's okay, solely because I like this matchup. All right, Rashad Bateman had a bad week 3, right? 4.9 fantasy points, 4 targets, 2 receptions after 13.9 points in week 1 and 20.8 points in week 2. But I think you still have to start Bateman. This Bills secondary is banged up. We saw it on display versus the Miami Dolphins in week 3. Bateman continues to be a player who's the #1 target for Lamar Jackson, who is absolutely balling out right now. So I still like Bateman as a start, and I still like Devin Duvernay. He's coming in as wide receiver 21 as a solid flex option. 21.4 points in week 1, 12.2 in week 2, 10.3 in week 3. He has 3 touchdowns on the season, and guess what? He's only been targeted 8 times. That's insane, okay? And he has caught every football that's been thrown his way. 8 receptions, 3 of them are touchdowns. He's still a player you have to consider flexing. This Ravens offense is looking very good from a passing perspective, and Bateman and Duvernay, outside of Mark Andrews, have been the main beneficiaries of this passing attack. So there's still starts for me moving into week 4. All right, Cardinals at Panthers. Hollywood Brown is in our lineup. Told you guys last week, going up against the Rams, who have been very bad against opposing receivers. I loved Hollywood Brown. He had his best day of the season. 14.3 points in week 1, 12.8 in week 2, 28 points on the dot in week 3, 17 targets, 14 receptions, 140 receiving yards. Yeah, I get it. This offense looks like they're in a little bit of trouble, not necessarily consistent, but what they have proven is that Kyler Murray is going to throw the football to Hollywood Brown. He continues to be a start for me. And Greg Dortch is the other player, my guy, Greggy D, who I've loved on the waivers the last 2 weeks or so. He's a start, man. I mean, 10 targets in week 3, 9 receptions, 80 receiving yards. He has gotten you double-digit fantasy points in full PPR every game of the season thus far. Rondale Moore is still questionable, could be ready to go week 4, might not be ready until week 5. AJ Green, on the other hand, is set up to miss week 4, and Andy Isabella has been playing awful. I mean, he's been playing absolutely, he's trash. So Greg Dortch and Hollywood Brown are viable options going into this matchup against the Panthers. They are the only receivers at the moment, unless Rondale Moore is healthy, which in that case, I think you just kind of sit back and watch and see what happens, and you start Hollywood Brown and or Greg Dortch moving into week 4. DJ Moore is a sit for me. I just don't like this offense. I mean, Robbie Anderson's coming in as wide receiver 56 after having 21 fantasy points in week 1. Laviska Shenault had a big game in week 3 at 17 fantasy points off just 2 targets. Shai Smith hasn't been consistent whatsoever, and DJ Moore, unfortunately, it's really hurting your fantasy teams right now because you're probably drafting him somewhere between the 2nd and the 4th round, depending on the size of your league, and he has just not been productive, mainly because this offense has not been productive. He's wide receiver 61, has 6 targets in each game this season, but he has had no more than 3 receptions in each game this season. Week 2, he found the end zone, so he saved his fantasy stat line. Overall, I just think if you have better options, DJ Moore has to be a receiver you consider sitting moving into week 4. All right, Broncos at Raiders. Courtland Sutton is the best fantasy player on the Broncos. He's had at least 7 targets in each game this season. Week 3, he had 10 targets, 8 receptions, 97 receiving yards. He's your wide receiver 17 in full PPR. Sutton is really the only player on the Broncos I'm confident in starting in fantasy right now, and that includes Jerry Jeudy, who I think is just a player to watch. I know it hurts, right, because he's a player you probably spent decent draft capital on, but he's coming in as wide receiver 57. He only saw a 59% snap share in week 3 after the big week 1 at 20.2 fantasy points, 2.2 points in week 2, 3.7 in week 3. I'm just sitting back and watching Jeudy. I am really not a fan of this Broncos offense. Like I said, the only player I would feel confident in starting on that offense is Courtland Sutton. All right, Devontae Adams is your wide receiver 11 at the moment. 30.1 fantasy points in week 1, 9.2 in week 2, 14.2 in week 3. He has a touchdown in every game this season. You're starting Devontae Adams if you own him, even if he's been semi-disappointing overall. Like I said, still a top 12 receiver in the league and has scored every game this season. Mac Hollins is a potential flex. Full PPR leagues, deeper leagues, you can roll the dice on Mac Hollins. Did nothing in week 1, then 11.6 points in week 2, and then a monster game in week 3, 29.96 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 receptions, 158 receiving yards, and a score in week 3. Listen, guys, it's a good matchup overall, but I'm not crazy about this matchup. And at the end of the day, I could see a lot of disappointment in Mac Hollins in week 4. I could see him coming back to earth, and so there's an asterisk here. This is really if you don't have better options. I want to see this pattern be consistent. Listen, week 2, he still got you double-digit fantasy points. Week 3 had the monster game. So the pattern's starting, but I just want to see a little bit more before I'm completely confident in starting Mac Hollins. Keelan Cole has done nothing on the season. He's not worth mentioning, but what in the world has happened to my boy Hunter Renfrow, who missed week 3 and has not netted more than 8.9 fantasy points on the season? Hunter Renfrow, one of my favorite receivers to target, especially in full PPR leagues. In your drafts, he's done nothing. It's been, I don't know what to do with both these offenses, really. The Nathaniel Hackett-led Broncos and the Josh McDaniels-led Raiders. They are really producing disappointing fantasy starters for us. So I think Hunter Renfrow has to be a sit moving into week 4. All right, the Patriots wide receivers are not worth starting. Jacoby Myers missed week 3. Devontae Parker had a really nice week 3. Maybe you can keep an eye on him. But overall, Mac Jones is injured, and if he misses this game, I don't want to start any Patriots receivers, and it looks like Mac Jones is probably going to miss this game. So for me at the moment, like I said, he could consider Devontae Parker, but I'm probably sitting any Patriots receivers, and you guys probably agree with me on that one. Allen Lazard now has a touchdown in both games he's played this season. 6 targets in week 3, 4 receptions, 45 receiving yards, and a score. He is the Packers receiver to start at the moment. Christian Watson and Sammy Watkins both dealing with injuries. Guess what? Romeo Dubes, my guy, the Doobies, stepped up in week 4 big time. 20.3 fantasy points, 8 targets, 8 receptions, 73 receiving yards, and a score. You know Aaron Rodgers loves this. You know if this pattern continues, it's not going to stop. If he can trust Romeo Dubs, he is going to continue to trust him. We saw some of this in the offseason. Now it's coming to life. He is not only a top waiver priority for that reason, but a solid flex, in my opinion, going up against the Patriots in week 4. All right, Chiefs at Buccaneers. You're sitting the Chiefs receivers, in my humble opinion. If you have to start one, it's probably Juju. Kind of bounced back in week 3, 9.9 points in week 1, 4 in week 2, 13.9 in week 3. Listen, guys, I like consistency, and I just don't see it with Juju, so I've got him as a sit. I don't love this game script, and really the problem with the Chiefs is they're just going to be spreading the football all over the place. We haven't seen anyone at the wide receiver position step up and be a consistent factor. MVS had 8.8 fantasy points in week 3. Sky Moore had negative points in week 3. McCole Hardman had 1.2 points. So the closest thing to consistency is Juju Smith-Schuster, but I'm just not in love with the start. I think you probably have better options overall. The only receiver you want to be starting on this team is the tight end Travis Kelce, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Mike Evans is coming back from suspension. He's a start for me. I mean, if you own Mike Evans, you have to start him, right? 18.1 fantasy points in week 1, 9.1 in week 2 versus the Saints. I think you start him here in week 4 versus Kansas City, especially with how many injuries we've seen to this team at the wide receiver position. Speaking of injuries to wide receivers on this team, I just have Chris Godwin, Russell Gage, and Julio as watches, right? Russell Gage stepped up big time in week 3. As long as he plays in this game, right? We just never know when an injury is going to pop up for any of these receivers. He's worth a flex option. Why not? But all these receivers impact each other, right? Chris Godwin is now officially questionable. He might be able to suit up in week 4, which impacts Russell Gage, right? Julio Jones missed week 3. He might be ready. He's actually expected to return in week 4, which affects Russell Gage. Like, it's too all over the place. Rashad Perryman had a nice week 2, had an awful week 3, was not a factor. And then we have Scotty Miller on this team, who had 5 targets in week 3. Then we have the addition of Cole Beasley in week 3. Like, it's all over the place, guys. I mean, honestly, let me know in the comments, what are you guys doing with the Bucs receivers. I think if Chris Godwin is healthy, you can play him, but there's just a risk of re-injury, right? So I probably like Evans and Russell Gage the most, but Julio Jones is worth a flex option, I guess. I don't know. I'm watching the Bucs receivers. I'm going to leave it at that. Start Mike Evans. Keep an eye on everyone else on this team. We need to see some consistent patterns emerge for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers receivers before we're confident in starting them moving into week 4. All right, Rams at Niners. Guess what? Cooper Kupp is your wide receiver 2 in full PPR. Imagine that. 31.8 points in week 1, 30.8 in week 2, 16.4 in week 3. He is a must start on a weekly basis. He did not have a receiving touchdown in week 3, but he scored his first career rushing touchdown in week 3. This guy can do it all. He's on the field 100% of the time. He's going to get you double-digit fantasy points almost every single week of the year. He's going to draw a ton of targets. There's not much else to say. If you own Kupp, you're starting him. Allen Robinson has been an absolute disappointment. Coming off of a nice week 2 performance, 15.3 fantasy points in week 2, came back to earth, 4.3 fantasy points, held to 2 catches off 5 targets in week 3. I just want to see more consistency out of Robinson before we even come close to considering him as a weekly start. And I know that hurts because he probably spent decent draft capital on him, but I think he's a sit going up against this Niners defense. Deebo Samuel, a little bit disappointing on the season. Wide receiver 33 in full PPR at the moment. 11.6 points in week 1, 13.7 in week 2, 12.9 in week 3. I think you continue to roll with Deebo. He's still giving you enough productivity that he should be in your starting lineups, but he has not found the end zone through the receiving game yet on the year. So listen, I'll say this much. The Rams defense is giving up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers. So I do like Deebo this week. And obviously, if you own Deebo, you're probably starting him anyways. Brandon Ayuk is worth a solid flex option going up against this Rams defense here in week 4. After having double-digit fantasy points in the last 2 weeks, I really like Ayuk. I would even consider him as a wide receiver 2 if you have to. The upside against this defense is for real on Monday Night Football. So I like Deebo and I like Brandon Ayuk. I think you leave Robinson as a sit, and obviously you're starting Cooper Kupp moving it to week 4. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing to the channel. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Start, sits, drops, ads, roster advice, trade advice, quarterbacks, receivers, running backs, tight ends, kickers, defense, whatever it is, guys, let me know down below. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And be sure to join our weekly fantasy Q&A live segment so we can get your guys' rosters correct. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.